Oh, good evening, everybody. My name is Vladimír Zeman, and I'm the president of the European Gymnastics Trampoline Technical Committee. Welcome to our next webinar prepared by the TC. I'm really happy that about 100 participants from 25 countries from Europe registered for this webinar, and also some participants from other continents. First of all, I would like to thank you very much to all of you who participated in a questionnaire that we delivered to the participants of previous webinars and sent us their feedback. Your opinion and comments are very important for us, and we are very pleased to have positive feedback from you. And before I welcome and introduce you on our special guest and expert today, I would like to provide you with the information where you can find the previous webinars. Sorry, the last one, the reducing injury risk, will be published on Monday, but it is prepared and will be on the internet again. Together with the others. The others are already there. Basically, you can find the webinars either on the European Gymnastics website, what is a bit difficult, I would say. Much more easy it's to find and to go to European Gymnastics YouTube channel. And now I would like to introduce our expert, our special guest for today. Hardy Fink. Hardy is a very long time education expert and education commission member of the FIG. He was working as FIG director of education and academy programs for 15 years. And during this time, he was very active in two basic pillars of the FIG education, what was the academy program and the courses in this program in all gymnastics disciplines have been presented to nearly 9,000 different coaches from 141 countries. The second pillar is age group development program, what is basically a recipe for dozens of national federations around the world, helping in development of the sport, of the discipline in all countries around the world. It's necessary also to mention he was a MEN-TC member and president, FIG MEN-TC member and president for 16 years. And as you know from the introduction on the internet, Hardy Fink comes from Canada, and he was also 12 years Canadian men national coach and high performance director. And last but not least, he was also a gymnast. What is special thing because he has own experience from gymnastics. Welcome, Hardy.
Hello, Vladimir. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And I guess good evening to you. Good morning for me on the West Coast. And good evening to all the participants. I'd like to start by thanking the European Trampoline Technical Committee for inviting me to make a presentation. It's always interesting for me to do this by Zoom. It's not quite the same as doing it live, as you know. I much prefer the live interactions at the many courses that we've had. For me, I did compete in trampoline, by the way, back in the 60s with a skill set that would make an 8-year-old laugh today, but I did compete. And I was a trampoline judge, a national judge in the 1970s. So I had some historical background in your disciplines as well. But my background was in mathematics and physics, but gymnastics derailed that. So it was an easy transition to go to biomechanics, coaching, and sports science. And then that, with my passion for all of the gymnastic sports and education, kind of got me to what you have just outlined in my background. So I think the common theme everywhere, of course, is how do we serve our gymnasts better? So they're not our slaves. We are, in some sense, their slaves. We have to do what is best for them. So, without getting too much more into the presentation, I'll start maybe by sharing my screen. If I can find the share button. Oops. Share screen. Looks like I'm sharing your screen. No? What are we seeing? Does that look right now?
Yeah, now I see your screen. Now I see your cover page of your presentation.
Okay, so I'll speak about effective high performance training, but not from a methodological point of view, more key points for coaches to consider. And I'll be focusing on adolescence. So I'll introduce the topic a bit. I'll take a look at forces in the three trampoline disciplines. And then we really have to understand something about the characteristics of adolescence. I'll look at very few injury considerations, then talk about effective training points. And I do want to touch on the age group development and competition program that you hinted at the beginning. So that'll be kind of the overview of what I do. So as a way of introduction, it's really quite complicated here because we have three very distinct sports and we have so many uses of the trampoline, especially trampoline and mini tramp for educational, for recreational uses. And we have so many different qualities of the apparatus used around the world. Clearly, the focus of this presentation is on high performance training, but we can't at the same time be unaware of what's out there and what's being used out there and how it's maybe being misused in many cases. So I'll touch that a little bit. And why the focus on adolescence? It's actually a bad term. I'll come to that later. I'm speaking about those years over which the children grow very rapidly. And it's a time when they're just ideal for learning advanced aerial and acrobatic skills. The neuromuscular system is just perfect for learning those skills. But at the same time, because they're growing, they're vulnerable to physical, emotional damage. And we have to protect them through those growing years. And rather than force them into high competition difficulty, we protect them and we'll have champions at the end of it, or we lose them. So that'll be kind of the way we think about care. There are some things we know, and this is not specific to trampoline. It's the gymnastic sports under FIG. And it applies variously to all of them, but more or less we know that a very, very tiny percentage of gymnasts pursue high performance. Very few ever qualify for worlds. If you look at the world championship results over an entire Olympic cycle, at the senior level, there's fewer than 1,000 different names that compete at the world level. And yet we have 40, 50 million participants in our gymnastics activities. We also know, it varies a little bit among disciplines, and we don't have data for all of them, but about 80% of high performance gymnasts retire by the time they're 14 or so. And those are kids that are selected and they're talented and they're committed and they're motivated and they've been successful and they have support systems and federations and clubs have invested in them. And then we lose them at age 14. Now, many for legitimate reasons, but way too many because of what we sometimes do as coaches. We also know, and it varies a little bit, but high performance gymnasts tend to mature later than the average population by 2, 3, even 4 years, depending on the discipline. So for example, an acrobatic top is a late mature for sure. An acrobatic bottom might actually be an early mature. So there's some variation, but in general, our acrobatic athletes are late matures. We also know across the sports that about 25% of training time is lost or modified because of various injuries, sometimes overuse and acute, and sometimes chronic injuries. So it can be trained smarter, more efficiently, more sophisticated. And then I've spoken quite a lot in the past few years, especially on excesses. And I'm speaking more about technical excesses. I don't want to touch the whole category of the abusive things that we see now on YouTube and in the internet and the media, but the technical abuses by coaches for too many training hours, excesses in numbers of repetitions, excessive rushing of difficulty, sometimes excessive body shaming. And the one thing that isn't excessive is insufficient recovery time to allow the body to adapt to the training loads. Those are real problems, technical problems that the coaches have to be aware of. And then finally, the leaders sometimes make unwise competition rules. And those rules can predispose coaches to follow abusive practices and thereby lose gymnasts. And I'll touch each of those topics a little bit. These sort of background pieces of information should inform how we interact and how we care for our gymnasts. So let me take a quick look at the forces in the trampoline sports. There's Sir Isaac Newton, a 50-pound note, as I call him, the master of force. So it's really useful to understand how high the forces are that our gymnasts must sustain, especially during landings, and they must generate, especially during takeoffs. So I'm indebted to Ignacio Grandi for this series of little videos, jumping from about 30 centimeters, landing on a force platform with different qualities of landing. So this is a high quality landing, and you can see the peak force is around 2 times body weight. This is a stiffer landing. In other words, the forces are not dissipated enough, and that is a little bit stiffer, so it comes out to just about 4 times body weight. And a rather stiff landing goes all the way up to 6 times body weight. So just from 30 centimeters, the quality of landing, the quality of preparation for landing can increase the peak force from 2 to 6 times body weight. So if anything, this tells us how important preparation for landing is, how important it is to complete the trick, the salto, and be able to apply forces over a period of time. There are many, many studies over the decades that have been done measuring external forces, as we just saw on a force platform. And typically the landing forces are almost double the height of takeoff forces. So takeoff force might be 6 to 8 times body weight, depending on the surface, and landing forces up to 15 or times body weight, in some cases even more. From our apparatus testing institute, Ludwig Schweitzer, we have these measures, 54 different athletes landing from 2 meters, 2.5 meters, and 3 meters. And you can see that the peak forces at a 3 meter landing vary from about 6 to 16 times body weight. And that's all related to the quality of the person landing, the quality of how that person applies forces over time. And if they land rather stiff, very, very high forces. So again, landing technique is really, really important. So here's an illustration from Dr. Bill Sands, jumping from a force platform. Look at the takeoff and then the landing. Takeoff, peak force landing, so much higher. That's an illustration of why landing forces can be much higher than takeoff forces. A couple of years ago, I did an analysis, and this was just a mathematical analysis of what it would mean to fall from 3.5, 4.5, and 6 meters center of gravity drop on trampoline. And trampoline is a little complicated because there's not a sudden stop, because the gymnast contacts the bed, and as you know, continues to push downward, exert downward force to store energy in the trampoline bed so that that energy will be returned. So I estimated here, you see the question marks here, the contact time of 0.3 seconds. And then I estimated the peak forces, say at 6 meters, of up to about 13 times body weight. That's 7,000 newtons for a 60 kilogram gymnast. So a Newton is a measure of force, and it doesn't mean a whole lot to the average coach. So whenever you see the word Newton, divide by 10 and you get an approximate value for kilograms. Everyone understands that 7,000 newtons, if it's 700 kilograms, you know that's a lot of force. Okay, so you get some idea, approximately dividing by 10. So the problem with this calculation, of course, is that I'm not certain about this. I was estimating 0.3 seconds. If that becomes 0.1 second, these forces triple. So the next slide shows, again from the FIG Apparatus Commission at the World Cup in Shanghai, the frequency of force distribution over, there were 530 jumps by the various athletes in competition. So you can see a maximum force way out over here of 13,000 newtons, 1,300 kilograms. The average, the most frequent force, was in the order of just about 10,000 newtons, 1,000 kilograms. So that's the most frequent occurrence of force. Those are huge forces. So that suggests to me that my estimate of 0.3 seconds during contact time is a bit high. It's closer to 0.2 seconds. Then we can look for, this would be especially for double mini tramp, for landings not on a trampoline bed, but landing on a mat. And again, you can estimate from the height of center of gravity. If it's 4.5 meters, then again for 50 kilo, well, it doesn't matter the weight, but we can look at 9-10 times body weight. And here I estimated a landing time of 0.1 second. If we can increase that landing time to 0.3 seconds, and that means applying force over a longer period of time, then we get the bottom line. We basically cut the peak force to 1/3. We cut it by 2/3. So again, landing technique can be very, very important. Of course, the nature of the mat can have an impact here as well. Mentioned that internal forces, this is from Dr. Brueggemann, internal forces can be much, much higher than external forces. The external forces are measured on the force platform. So we can look at the tibiotalar joint, and that's the talus here. This bone is the talus, and the tibia, the bigger bone in the bottom of the foot, sits on top of the talus like this. And that's the ankle joint. Inside there, 23 times body weight, 11,000 newtons, 1,100 kilograms has been measured. The next joint over, and that's the talus again, the navicular bone. So this talus navicular joint, this joint in here, you can imagine if you under rotate, that presses together very strongly and can cause bone chips. Inside there, 19 times body weight. And all of us know what the Achilles tendon is, 15 times body weight. So the internal forces are much, much higher than external forces, and they're close to the upper tolerance limit of the tissue. It might be worthwhile pointing out that if we had a sustained force this high, it would break the bone. But our bones are very good at instantaneous forces, at sustaining them. It's not like a sustained force of 1,000 kilograms. This was a study published last year. They were looking at, on the trampoline, on asymmetrical loads internally. So asymmetrical because of sometimes torque landings or torque twisting for takeoff, or injured athlete protecting one side of the body. And if you look inside the ankle, inside the knee, and inside the hip joint, all the forces are between 3,000 and 4,000 newtons. Really high internal forces that the body has to deal with. So in general, forces that must be generated by the gymnast and sustained are very, very high and approach biological limits. Landing forces are higher than takeoff forces, so landing technique must be mastered. Each landing, by the way, is an eccentric contraction. Those of you that have remember our lectures on muscle physiology, an eccentric contraction is much higher, is much more powerful than the normal contraction where the muscle shortens, and that requires special physical preparation. And under rotating, under twisting leads to shear forces So shear forces, crossways forces like this, or torsion forces that can cause damage. If a gymnast is tired after many repetitions, the muscle fatigues, force expression goes down. Bigger chance of injury, bigger chance of bad performance. Internal forces are higher than external, and tissues, all tissues, ligaments, tendons, bones, must be prepared systematically over time to sustain and generate these forces. So that's all I think I want to say about that. Let's look at adolescence and what the characteristics are. So the word adolescence, I'm misusing it a little bit. It usually refers to post-puberty. And I'm looking at it for age group 11 to 15, which is the age of rapid growth, 11 to 13 approximately for girls, 13 to 15 approximately for boys. So I've lumped it together, 11 to 15. And we really, as coaches, must understand what is happening in this time period. Okay? It's a critical time because they're capable of learning these complex aerial and acrobatic skills very quickly. But they're simultaneously susceptible to debilitating, really debilitating acute and chronic physical injuries and to emotional and psychological damage. Okay? So this is the time they should train the future. They shouldn't compete the future. So all the future big complex skills can be trained under safe conditions, should be trained under safe conditions. They should not appear in competition where they have to be trained and then competed under, let's call it hard conditions, competition conditions. And you'll see my little train the future sign several times. I think it's such an important thing. So we started the Academy program many, many years ago by looking at all the medical and scientific information about how a child grows from infancy to adulthood. And I'm focusing now, and that ended up, by the way, being about a 45-page booklet for each of the disciplines that was distributed worldwide, long lost, I suppose. I'm going to focus now on age 11 to 13 to 15, the early pubertal stage, and it's that stage of skill acquisition when they can learn skills. And we know from the data what the maturational characteristics are at that age, and then we should look at the implications for training. So we know that in that time period, they're going to grow rapidly for 2 or 3 years. We know that bones grow faster than muscles. And we know they gain mass faster than strength. Okay? So by bones growing faster than muscles, as the bone grows, the muscle, the tendon attaches to the bones. It means that being stretched, it's almost the same as flexibility training, constantly under stretch. Okay, so the children at this age are a little bit more stiff. So we can still do flexibility training, but we have to be careful with adding complexity that requires increased strength, increased flexibility, especially dynamically. So this is a time to reduce the emphasis on complex skills in competition and never to under-rotate. And I always want to say, yes, train the complex skills, don't compete them. Okay, so they're a little bit more stiff at this time period. And if I talk about the 2 or 3 year growth spurt, here's what that means. From infancy on, in the very early parts, really early years, the child grows very rapidly. This is a velocity curve. So this is like 20 centimeters a year, drops down. And then for many years, they grow approximately 5 centimeters a year. Every year, 5 centimeters a year. And suddenly, now this is for the average child. We'll talk about the gymnastics population that matures a little later. For the average child, girls will suddenly start growing more rapidly at around age 10. And then they'll reach a peak velocity of growth and then reach basically their adult height. It's about 2 to 3 years. Boys, approximately 2 years later for takeoff, reach their peak height 2 or 3 years later, and then taper off to reach their adult height. So the average girls are 2 years more advanced than boys. And every child follows this pathway, although the tempo and the timing can vary very dramatically. Now, if we think, as I'll mention again later, that our gymnastics population, especially the acrobatic ones, the aerobatic ones, tend to mature 2 years later, then the women's curve is more like the boys' curve, and the boys' curve moves 2 years over. So it's that time period, that's the pink triangle, the blue triangle, is the time that we have to be very, very careful. And we should know those moments. I'll come back to that. So during that time period, that very short 2 or 3 years, here's what happens. Boys on the average add 20 kilos and 20 centimeters. Girls 16 kilograms and 16 centimeters. They're no longer the same person, psychologically, emotionally, physically, physiologically, and biomechanically. We're dealing with a different person, and you have to deal with them differently as well. Okay. So you should know the moment of takeoff, when they start to grow, and the peak height velocity moment. This is for sophisticated coaching. You should know that moment. And there are a number of ways. If you measure as they get close to 10 years old for girls and close to 11 or 12 for boys, measure them every month. And you'll see same increment, same increment, same increment, suddenly a bigger increment. Takeoff. And then you can track as the increments become maybe as much as 6 centimeters a year. Okay, so that's time to be careful. Or you can, the first thing that grows are the extremities, the feet grow first. Every child can have a piece of wood with their foot measure drawn on it. And then every 3 months or so, as they get to that age, they can draw their foot and see tiny increment, tiny increment, tiny, bigger increment, take off. So at that time, start to be careful, start to think about what you're doing, start to think about protecting those athletes for the next couple of years. I'm indebted to Jose Miguel Cantos for this information. He did some analysis on the adolescent dip in the various parameters of how athletes or trampolinists are judged. And you can look right here for female athletes in that time period, in that age period, in that age period, in that age period. There is a legitimate drop also in performance parameters. And exactly the same happens for boys. So not only is it something that we have to know, we have to take care of physiologically, we can also look at the data and say, hey, yeah, this is an important time. Going back to this athlete development model, again, this comes from the beginnings of our academy programs. We know that body parts grow at amazingly different rates. For example, the feet grow first, and so on. We know that the legs will grow about 5 times from childhood, the trunk only about 2 times from childhood, or 3 times to adulthood. The process of growth, of bone growth, is metabolically very expensive. They need a lot of good nutrition. This is not the time to put children on a diet. They should eat, just, I'd like to say it this way, they should eat as much good food as they can without gaining fat. Okay, and we know in some of our disciplines exactly the opposite happens by coaching interventions, by weighing them, by body shaming, and so on. And also during this time, the growth plates, I'll come to that in a second, are very wide and can be easily damaged. Once again, this is the time to reduce the emphasis on complex skills. Never, ever allow under rotation. So I said earlier, they're a little more stiff. They're a little more clumsy because the body parts are growing strangely. They've gained more, they're still strong, but compared to their body weight, they're a little less strong. So we have this complex of problems that we as coaches have to understand to protect them. So just a quick review of what the growth plates are. At the end of every long bone, so the femur, the tibia, the arm bones, and so on, each finger, or maybe 50 such long bones in the body. Each end is a growth plate, marked in blue here. On top of the bones, we call it epiphyseal, on top of growth plate. And it's made for compression forces. But we can overdo it. We can damage it by doing too much. And so there's about 100 of those at the end of long bones. We don't worry so much about fingers and toes, but we certainly worry about the bigger bones in our sports. Interestingly, if you think of rock climbing, which is a little bit of an aside, they really have the finger problems because they're hanging on with their fingers. and the growth plate is instead of being compressed, it's elongated. So they have problems there. Then we have bone bumps on a bone wherever a tendon, where a muscle attaches with a tendon to a bone. Those are apophyseal growth plates, and they're constantly under traction, under pull, because the tendon and the muscle contracts, the tendon pulls. You can imagine the Achilles tendon pulling on the heel bone. And the growth plate under there can be torn off, called an avulsion fracture, if the stresses are too high. Now, as an adult, we don't have growth plates at all. So we will never tear an Achilles, or never tear a piece of bone off, but we'll tear an Achilles tendon, as you've seen happen, I'm sure. So what's important to realize is that the growth plate, it's cartilage, it's growth cartilage, it's not as strong as bone, and it can be damaged by excessive shear forces and torsion forces, and of course, overdoing the number of compression forces without adequate rest. So we have to be careful, never permit under-rotated saltos or twists, ever in all of life probably, but certainly not during the growth years. So this is kind of a progression. You can see how the structure of the hand changes, and the growth plates at around age 12 here are still very open. They're not yet fused, they have not yet become bone. And finally, the last part of this, remember it's a 45-page booklet, I'm just selecting a little bit. Gymnasts, as I mentioned earlier, tend to be late matures, and certainly in artistic women's gymnastics and men and acrobatic tops, the more successful they are, the later they are on the maturation spectrum. So their growth plates are open for that prolonged period of time, which means they're susceptible to growth plate injuries for a longer period of time. We always have to assure that they have sufficient air time to complete their twists and saltos, or land in a soft foam pit, for example. So we have the problem at this age period where peak height velocity, also peak weight velocity about a year later, growth plates that are not yet bone, have critical physical and psychological implications. And we have to protect our athletes during that time period. And maturation, as I said, there can be a big difference. So if you look at an 11-year-old, 12-year-old, there can be 6+ years of natural differences between a late maturing boy and an early maturing girl. For example, there can be 8 years of, even at age 12, difference. So these children, they were taking at various courses, are absolutely normal, but very different in terms of their maturation. Here is an X-ray of twin brothers. They're fraternal twins, obviously. And you can tell just by looking at the X-ray, which one has earlier or later maturation. This one here, this bone, the radius is quite fused. Here, the growth plate is still very visible. So this is a late mature compared to his twin brother. And just one other comment in this area. I said that every part of the body grows at different rates. Well, of course, the legs grow the most from baby to adulthood. And most of the growth, 2/3 of it, takes place right at the knee joint. And of course, what do we stress when we under-rotate saltos and under-rotate twists? We stress the knee joint. We stress those growth plates. We stress them with shear forces and with torsion forces. Okay, it's really important. And I think I've said this before, never permit under-rotated saltos or twists. That's going to be kind of a theme. Okay, so gymnasts in that period should focus on learning, less on competition. So we can have international competitions, but not before this period, not 8, 9, 10. And the focus should be on really basics, mastery, everything perfect for the future. And rules, whatever rules there are for competition, should be modified to reduce difficulty expectations. I can say as an aside that the trampoline community has done a wonderful job in that. Not so in some of the other disciplines. The trampoline community has very much de-emphasized the percentage of the final score that's attributable to difficulty, as they should. So just a couple of injury considerations. So when I actually spent quite a bit of time this last month or so looking at research information, and there's not a whole lot on double mini tramp and tumbling. And most of the trampoline information on injuries is everything lumped together. So that includes damaged trampolines or backyard tramps or trampoline parks or mini tramps or uses for learning in other sports, recreational uses, team gym, and then the freestyle, water tramps. Anything that's a trampoline injury is a trampoline injury. So we're all painted with the same brush, which is really not fair. And we really do need data on what is happening in our high performance sport, and that data is not available. I didn't want to show a video, but this one is maybe worth seeing. I think all of you have probably seen it. And here we go. So 8 flips. I personally cannot think that it can be acceptable to get into the air, tuck, and stay tucked until you hit, and consider that that's a performance. Of course, we have to be impressed by what this boy can do, but also very, very foolhardy. Also, the sources of error, if those people feeding the trampoline are a little bit unsynchronized, you have a source of error not even due to his own fault. And you know, I spoke before we got online. I spoke with Vladimir briefly about probably the need for the technical leadership in FIG and UEG and elsewhere to think about a way to accommodate the freestyle movement, because boys, maybe girls, want to do this stuff, but we have to also make sure that it's done in a way to protect them and protect our sport. So one component of safe environment are avoidable injuries. Your environment has to be safe. If it's not, it's your responsibility. Why do we have injuries because of bad equipment? It's the coach's responsibility. So these are photos that I took in various places where we had academies and age group program camps. Obviously, it doesn't apply to the very best programs, probably not to many of the people that are observing at this moment. But some of these photos were taken in national training centers, not specifically for trampoline, and in Olympic training centers. So from the perspective of tumbling, yeah, an enormous source of injuries is either a pit with something in it or mats that overlap or have gaps. Okay, that's just a coach's responsibility. You can't let that happen. Or springs that should no longer be used. Or this, that trampoline, believe it or not, was being used by children. Not during, when I run an academy, we make sure those things are off limits, but you go have lunch and come back and there's kids bouncing on it. In this top picture, kids were bouncing on trampoline with others sitting down here. Yeah, clever. This one, someone decided that, yeah, they can use the trampoline and still have the legs on it without the trampoline fully extended outward. So yeah, these are avoidable injuries. Let's not have any of those. So the anatomical distribution of injuries, it's pretty clear that it's mostly the lower limb. I don't think I have to go further there. But for landings, if sometimes if a gymnast lands following an injury, they'll favor one leg or one side of the body, and that can result in different stresses. So the vertical stresses here are very nicely distributed. Here they cause an interesting shear force on the tibia, just because the force is a little bit off center because the gymnast is favoring one foot. And those sort of things tell you something about what to do if a gymnast is injured. There are ways of training to stay fit, to keep fit, but certainly you have to avoid that sort of landing. Then under-rotated saltos. This is very common in all of our gymnastic sports, as you know, and this would be from tumbling and double mini perhaps. So the shear force, this is on the thoracic lumbar junction, so T12, L1. And the shear forces have been measured 30, 40, even 45 times body weight, just from that sort of landing. So we can't allow those under-rotated landings with the force being taken up by bending forward. Okay? Bruggen gave us some interesting information by doing some computer modeling on core training. So the muscles around the spinal column and the abdominal muscles. If they are very strong, they protect, they're kind of like a sleeve. You know, you have a pressure sleeve to measure your blood pressure, almost like that. A muscle envelope that can take up to 30% of the compression force in the spine. So one interesting indication of how important it is to have a very strong core and to do that sort of preparation. And just to look at some of the important growth plates, I mentioned this one, the distal femur. It's very wide. Most of the growth takes place there. We have to protect that one from shear and torsion forces, no under rotations. Then this one, the big quadricep muscle attaches to the tibial tuberosity. And underneath that is a growth plate that is constantly being pulled on, pull with the big, powerful quadricep muscle. And if that's inflamed, if it's unhappy, we call it Osgood-Schlatter's disease. And it's not a disease, at least not in maybe 1 in a million it is. For the most part, it's an unhappy growth plate. It's inflammation of that growth plate. And I think what's important to understand about these sort of growth plates is inflammation is temporary, but can be debilitating. All of you probably that are listening have had Osgood-Schlatter's problems. And for a sport that relies almost entirely on takeoffs with the legs, nobody wants to wait 2 or 3 years to come back and keep training. So you have to really slow down. You can do better physical preparation. You can do very soft landings, reduce the number of takeoffs, use a bungee cord, which really reduces the magnitude of the force, and so on. And one other on the Achilles tendon where it attaches to the calcaneus, that growth plate, if it's unhappy, it's called Sever's disease. Again, if the force is too great, or if it's accompanied by rotation or asymmetric landing, that can either chip the bone or tear off pieces of bone. So those are quite important for our uses. So I guess the main topic here was considerations for effective training during those years. So I'm not here to speak about training methodology. It's certainly not my expertise, and you have many experts that are online that can give a much better lecture about proper methodology for training. So a lot of what I've talked about up to now and what I'll speak about here is really what from the sports science complex of information can help you become a better coach, can help you protect your gymnast. What can you learn more about? What should you learn more about? And of course, we teach this in the Academy program, trying to be very specific for each of the disciplines. But let's just summarize some of the things. So what we need to emphasize, of course, is training for safety, training for quality, training for longevity in the sport. There's no reason to invest all of that time and energy and love and whatever, and then have the gymnast quit at 13 or 14. And training for future success. So during that adolescent growth period, that triangle that I showed on the velocity chart, we can reduce the risk by decreasing plyometric training. Plyometric training is very high force, and you can't do too much of it at that time. Notice in some sense, if you tumble, every landing, every takeoff is basically a plyometric contraction, because it's land takeoff very dynamically. So you're already doing lots of repetitions. If you also jump now from benches and so on for quick takeoffs, you may be doing more than you should. Should decrease the number of repetitions. This is related somewhat to endurance, there's a time for endurance training, but by becoming, for example, let's say you want to lift or need to jump with 50 kilograms. Well, if you can increase strength for 100 kilograms, then you can do 50 kilograms 50 times. So you don't need to do so many repetitions. Just by becoming stronger, you increase your ability to have greater muscular endurance. Certainly, we want to decrease shear and torsion forces, usually related to under rotation. We need to decrease unilateral asymmetric actions, especially in the growth years. And not only takeoff actions, but also landings. We have to eliminate unprepared and arched landings. We should monitor impact loading. How many high impacts are there in a training session, in a week, in a month, in a year? And we absolutely have to provide rest and recovery time. This is the best tool in our arsenal, and it's the one that coaches too often don't want to employ because they think that rest time is not useful time. Well, all the adaptation takes place, all the adaptation to the stresses, to the training loads take place during the rest period. And also we need rest and recovery if there's any kind of injury, even overuse and injuries and that sort of thing. So long training sessions should incorporate these strategies to reduce risks. So when we talk about training for safety, we speak about landings. I'll speak a little bit more about that, but I think how important a landing is has become evident in some of the things I've shown. And proprioception, standing on balls and soft surfaces and just ankle proprioception, also on the wrist. Core training, I mentioned a little bit of that, and muscle balance. Both, if you have a strong trunk, a strong abdomen, you should have strong back muscles. If you have strong quadricep muscles, you must have strong hamstring muscle. If you have a strong bicep, you must have strong tricep. You really have to work on muscle balance during those years. Otherwise, you'll lead to all kinds of problems. Now, the three trampoline sports have really somewhat different physical and physiological and technical demands. So it may be counterproductive to compete in more than one. Before all this COVID problem happened, I was privileged to watch a trampoline competition in another country. And it was interesting to watch in this environment where the gymnasts competed double mini, and then within half an hour jumped up on trampoline and competed trampoline. Well, the demands and the characteristics of those two apparatus are so different that to compete them so shortly, one after the other, you can imagine the outcome. First of all, the performance in double mini was suboptimal, and the trampoline performances were disasters. So I don't know, you people know much more about competing in both, but from my perspective, it probably isn't recommended. It's not like pommel horse and vaulting. They're very different. These are related enough that the other thing, trampoline and certainly the mount on double mini, there's none of our other gymnastic sports required that quality and that perfection. You can do a double back over the high bar and catch on your wrist and still catch and continue. Well, if you're off a little bit like that on trampoline, bye-bye for that performance. And you have to do it 10 times in a row. If you're off that much on the mount in double mini, well, bye-bye for a decent dismount. So the technical quality is so important that I don't think you can afford to compromise. Anyway, that's an aside. You know better than I about whether to do both. So train safe landings. So every landing must be a prepared landing. Prepared, that means extended and rotation completed. Every landing is an eccentric contraction, and that has to be trained specifically and trained progressively. Again, what is an eccentric contraction? If I can, I'm standing up here, if I can lift, say, 20 kilos, This is concentric. I'm shortening the muscle. And that's the maximum I could do, 20 kilos. Now, if I put 50 kilos on my hand, I can't lift it, but I can control it. Now, my muscle is trying to contract, but it's being forced to lengthen. Okay, that's an eccentric contraction. And you can see just from that simple example that the force there is much, much higher. It means it requires specific training and it requires more rest time. So, and every landing is an eccentric contraction. Gymnasts must prepare their muscles for that. So many, I suppose all of our landings have angular momentum, about 1 or 2 axes, and they also have either horizontal and or vertical momentum. So whenever we want to bring any momentum, horizontal, vertical, angular, to 0, we must apply forces. Remember that from level 1 biomechanics? If you complete the salto or the twist, you have reduced your angular momentum. You're now stretched, you're no longer rotating quickly in the tuck position, for example. If you're extended, you can apply forces for a longer period of time. Those examples I showed before, between 0.1 second or 0.3 second, well, that triples the peak force or cuts it to 1/3. Okay? And of course, prepared landings reduce shear and torsion forces. And really, for almost all landings in training, use soft landing mats or foam pits in that time period, especially in that age group. Just reduce the forces, reduce the stresses in the body, focus on perfect technique in the air. So strength versus power. So it's an interesting study as I was doing some research. So 1 repetition maximum, that's the maximum contraction, the maximum force a muscle can express 1 time. So 1 repetition maximum for leg extension correlates 0.8 to time of flight on trampoline. Not plyometric training. This is quite different. This is not, again, trampoline doesn't use plyometrics in quite the same way. It's pressed down into the trampoline to store energy. The energy is returned. So the training for time of flight in trampoline for maximum height is somewhat different than you would have in tumbling, which needs plyometric training for power and for speed. Not only plyometric training in the legs, but also in the trunk, forward and backward. Then the ACL ligament, the anterior cruciate ligament. I'm sure that many that are listening have had ACL tears. And that can be protected by making sure there's muscle balance. Almost no one has the hamstring muscle as strong as the quadricep muscle, and just the nature of how we walk and move and go upstairs and so on. But to protect the so what happens is, so here's the lower leg, here's the femur, and if I land, and so, it's usually like a ski jump landing. You land this way, fall back, but the femur wants to push, lean, move forward. So it's very often on backward landings, but you're rotating, but wanting to move forward. So this little ligament in here is the anterior cruciate ligament that stops that from pulling forward. At the same time, your quadricep muscle wants to pull it forward because now it's under eccentric stress. But there's a muscle, the hamstring, that attaches to the tibia back here that protects, that stops this movement forward. So the hamstring muscle is very seldom strong. So the eccentric strength of our hamstring muscle should be equal to our quadricep. And if you want to protect the anterior cruciate ligament, train hamstrings. And now tumbling requires specific power training for the very important body action, the snap action and the arch action. So if you just look at a sequence of tempo saltos or a sequence of back handsprings, you can see this snap, it's arch, snap, it's arch. Those actions must be trained, of course, but they should be understood biomechanically, because those are the actions, if done effectively, that generate the reaction forces you need for horizontal speed, for angular momentum, and for vertical velocity. That's not so much the case for trampoline and double mini, but absolutely crucial. So there is quite a difference in how you prepare the body for the different disciplines. And of course, core training protects the spine, as I mentioned, allows more effective application of vertical forces, and of course helps maintain the aesthetic body lines that we want to see in our sport. Of course, tumbling and double mini for the run-up require specific training for horizontal acceleration, horizontal velocity. So if everything is equal in terms of what the gymnast can do on the apparatus, the faster the approach velocity, the more successful will be the performance. You know, it's possible to run real fast and be do a terrible salto. But if the quality is the same, the faster the approach, the better. It's very similar to vaulting in men's and women's gymnastics. All things being equal, the faster the run, the better the vault. So that can require very specific training for acceleration. I mentioned a little bit about muscular endurance. There's a time early in training that muscular endurance is important. So lots of repetitions, relatively low or medium loads. But eventually, you don't want lots of repetitions. You want to increase the strength. And just by increasing strength alone, you increase muscular endurance in that muscle group. So it's one way to avoid excessive repetitions. By the way, by becoming stronger, you also increase speed, because the speed is a combination of, or power, I should say. You increase power. Power is a combination of speed and strength. So you can train speed, but if you get stronger, say you're going to throw 20 kilograms, if you become stronger, you can do that much more quickly. So strength training is useful for speed and for muscular endurance. So if we do too many repetitions in one workout session, like jump, 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 plyometric train, plyometric train, plyometric train, run, 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 land, 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 which is common. The stiffness of the tendons and ligaments is actually reduced. That means you're not as strong by significant amounts, depending on how many hundreds of repetitions are done in the training sessions. Of course, the maximum expression of strength is reduced because the muscle gets fatigued. The fluid so articular cartilage has, we'll call it water, has fluid inside it. So articular is the joint inside, and it's like a cushion, acts like a bit of a cushion. And over time, over many repetitions, that fluid gets pressed out. So eventually it's bone on bone. In some sense, especially as we get older, we shrink during the day for that very reason. We'll be 2 or 3 centimeters shorter at night than we are when we get up in the morning, because now the fluid has gone back into articular tissue. So by too many repetitions, we start having this bone on bone. I'm overemphasizing a little bit, but it increases the internal forces. Of course, later in the day, reduce vigilance. And unique for the leakage problem, the muscles of the pelvic floor become more fatigued. So that problem later in the workout is more problematic. So basically what that tells you is if you have long training loads, do it twice a day. Distribute the training loads over a day. In some cases, they'll do conditioning and then 2 more trainings, say 3 times a day, especially during training camps. And monitor the frequency of high impact loads or high force repetitions. Air mats to reduce peak forces. Maybe eventually that'll be the competition apparatus, I don't know. Provide sufficient recovery time for tissue adaptation. Okay. I mentioned that. And then, the one more syndrome. Do one more. So you've done a really advanced skill, complex skill, successfully for the first time. Now the coach gets excited and says, well, do it again, do it again, do it again. And now you suddenly start doing it badly. So it's a good time after a perfect repetition. Stop. Say, okay, good. Rest on that. Let your neuromuscular system integrate that, and we'll come back the next day. it's not a good time to keep doing more and more and more. Most likely they'll fail. Most likely they'll lead to frustration. And all you've done is practice badly multiple times. So it's just something to consider. Hey, that's good. Stop. Perfect. Positive feedback. And then you should monitor the gymnast's health, sleep, fatigue, feelings. There are online tools available for gymnasts to input this information daily. In my day, I had every one of my gymnasts have quite an extensive logbook that I could look at and see how they're doing. So those are things that you as a sophisticated coach should know. And then having good support teams, medical, physiotherapists, specialists of various kinds. Ideal, of course. This is just a little study that I found on bungees done by Dr. Bill Sands. So we know how bungee training, how many positives there are for that. But one of the attributes for this age group is that it reduces peak forces and accelerations by 40 to 70%. So that means more repetitions. And of course, all the positives, the coach doesn't have to be there holding a belt, gymnast can experiment and blah, 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 blah. So use those in training. So then we come to the topic of increasing difficulty too soon. So whenever we require a demand or reward, it's a reward problem, high competition difficulty, it's problematic for a whole bunch of reasons. And especially I'm dealing with this growing age group. It means we have to have more repetitions probably because it's a high difficulty trick you want to do. It means higher numbers and sizes of forces. Probably more training time and reduced recovery time because you want to get back at it. Usually, and always, I guess, it's accompanied by more complex rotations. And that can lead to under-rotated saltos and twists and unprepared landings. A good example is from artistic gymnastics, the difference between a double twist and a triple twist on floor, just a single salto, is 0.1. So why? The coaches, what they'll do for 0.1, or sometimes the rules reward that. For 0.1, what can you do instead? Make sure your legs get together, stay together, less fear. You can do thousands of repetitions into a pit, but don't compete it. For 0.1, really. And similar, I mentioned earlier, and I'm so pleased working with the age group programs and the team I had, the working group I had, that the age group rules for the trampoline sports really do take that into account. Difficulty, way down. It's not rewarded as a significant percentage of the final score. Of course, too early difficulty leads to permanent errors. Going back to what I said, this one thing what is done for the World Age Group Championships, but many regions within countries or many clubs or many coaches have their own wishes for high difficulty early to show off whatever. Be careful. So of course it increases the risk of injury and fear. And interesting question to ask, what is the best predictor of an injury? The best predictor is a pre-existing injury. If a gymnast has had an injury before, the chance of being injured again increases dramatically. So, of course, if you're forcing difficulty, it increases the stress and anxiety for the gymnast and for the coach. It increases the likelihood to train injured and lost training time, and increases coaching negativity. So the coach is angry, frustrated, insults you, blames you, punishes, and so on. So the problem, of course, if difficulty is too soon, if it's demanded by the rules or by the leadership or by the coach or by the club, whatever, the abuse, the technical abuses that I refer to, can pay off because it seems to become a necessity, because it's a race against puberty. We want to learn these big tricks before puberty suddenly hits. So we have to be a bit careful. Don't increase difficulty. Train the future. Don't compete the future. Just a quick my mathematical background. At the last World Championships I was at, I was stunned to see that the trampoline performances, the failure rate for seniors was in the order of 50%. This is in qualification. 45, 50% of routines fail. So you have to look at what's happening here. And we can look at from a different perspective on what it means to add difficulty from a cost-benefit analysis. And who benefits? Is it the coach? Is it the gymnast? Sometimes. So if we look at 90% consistency on a trick, probably pretty good. One trick, 90%, two tricks, 90, 5 tricks, 90, 10 tricks at 90%. Yeah, that's probably pretty common. But then when we look at what we can expect, the statistical expectation, probability that these performances will be successful. Well, if it's one trick at 90%, yeah, you have a 90% chance of hitting your routine. If it's two at 90%, it's 81%. If 5 tricks are 90% and 5 are 100%, you're down to below 60%. If it's 10, the probability, of course, the psychological factors can make it worse or better, depending on the athlete. 10 tricks at 90%, chance of hitting your routine is about a third. Or you might have a situation of 3 90s, 3 80s, 2 70s, 2 60s. There's your 10 tricks. Well, you're down below 7%. So we tend to blame the gymnasts for absolute predictable outcomes of our decisions. So what can you do instead? And it's always quality. So we can, in all of our gymnastics disciplines, we can kind of know the future because we've come pretty darn close, unless the apparatus changes dramatically, come pretty darn close to the maximum difficult tricks that are possible. Not everyone can do them, but we know. So if we look at the future for these age group kids, 15, 20 years down in the future, it doesn't help to copy what's being done now. We have to predict the future. We know the difficulty, approximately. The future has to be quality. And especially on trampoline, the quality, and double mini, the quality in the landing areas, the changes in time of flight, the changes in the displacement, even the 4x4 trampoline requires ever more quality. And that'll go onward into the future. So big tricks without perfect quality early on, maintained for decades, is not a future at all. So I wanted to look quickly at the age group development and competition program that we put together. There I've listed I've really been blessed to work with these super experts for the Academy Working Group. And then for the age group working group, some of them might be online. So it's a recipe, as Vladimir mentioned right at the very beginning, for coach, for clubs, and for federations. And it's appropriate for the overwhelming majority of gymnasts, coaches, and clubs, because very few have the resources to develop their own. Why would they try when this group of experts I've just identified did it for you? And it's related, the age group program is related to the academy program in this way. So in level 1, we teach, so the age group program, the competition part, has high performance 1, high performance 2, high performance 3, high performance 4 for age groups. So in level 1, we teach approximately the content of high performance 1 and 2. Level 2, approximately the content of high performance 3 and 4 of the age group program. And level 3, of course, advanced junior and senior skills. It's online, but I just looked on, the videos are not yet there, so it's a different problem. So within the age group program, we have these skill acquisition profiles. This is page 1 for men's trampoline. There's 3 or 4 pages, and then for women and for synchronized, blah, 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 blah. And basically, it looks up here at the ages or the years of training even, and quality should be perfected at this time. So 4 is perfect quality. 1 is the element is introduced. And this is for women's tumbling. So 2 means 1 introduced, 2, yeah, it can be performed, 3 might be ready for domestic competition, 4 is good enough for international competition or close to perfect. So it's a way for coaches that don't know much to look through and see how they're doing or what is appropriate for their age group. And here's for women's double mini. We have it for, multiple pages for each discipline for men and for women. And this exists also for every one of our gymnastic sports. On the competition structure, we've divided it into high performance stream and participation stream. So thousands of gymnasts participate for fun. They love the sport, they participate. They might start late, maybe they start when they're in high school or even university. and there's really no place for them in the high performance spectrum, or they don't want to do that. So we have a set of modified rules, first with compulsories, and then adding some optionals for participation. And then we've got the high performance stream. High performance 1 and 2 is not part of the FIG age group rules, but high performance 3, we say, and 4, that's the FIG age group rule. So we didn't touch that, partly because they already follow the philosophy that we've tried to entrench. But what we did do here is allow an overlap of ages. For example, an 11-year-old might not yet be ready for this level. So park for a year is a really important part of, during these growth years, to rather than force gymnasts ahead into the next category, allow them to park, have an overlap year. Okay? From high performance 3 to 4, allow an overlap year. To junior, allow an overlap year. Even junior, senior, allow an overlap year. So you don't force them into the higher difficulty and maybe get them frustrated and they quit. We don't want to lose anyone. So I won't go through this. These are in the online, and you can look at the requirements we have for the age groups, and they follow the philosophy that I've mentioned. So in summary, we want, of course, safe, healthy, systematic training of gymnasts towards excellence. We want to avoid the permanent handicaps, which include deductions and fear and bad basics. We need to understand what the characteristics are of children in this rapid growth period. They learn complex skills easily. They have rapid internal, external growth all over the place, all different. They're susceptible to all kinds of injuries and to emotional and psychological damage. And these problems are exacerbated because they tend to mature later than the average. So if we can be careful with them, if we can protect them through this time period, you'll have a champion. We know about the 80% dropout rate around that age. Well, we don't want any of those dropouts to be because of our coaching behaviors. If we protect them, we'll have a champion. Otherwise, we'll lose them. So again, train the future. Don't compete the future. Again, we want careful, gradual progress toward perfection. So it's perfect physical, perfect technical perfection before skills. You can imagine in trampoline, nothing is more important than a perfect bounce. There's no use being able to do a double back if you don't know how to bounce well. But we see it happen. Provide sufficient rest and recovery. I can't stress that enough. I think that's one of our big failings. Reduce competition difficulty content during those growth periods. Don't compete too early internationally either. And use compulsory exercises of strongly modified expectation, because if you leave it wide open, the coaches will look at the code or look at the rules and say, I'm going to go for this trick to maximize difficulty. So compulsories protect the gymnast and they serve as coach education. So coaches, gymnasts, leaders, people that make rules, everyone, train the future. Don't compete the future, and don't sacrifice the future for the present, for the now. So I think that's my presentation. I thank you so much for your attention. And I suppose, Vladimir, it's time for questions.
Okay. Can I stop your presentation?
Yeah, I've just gone. Yeah.
Yes. Hardy, thank you very much. It was a very big and very interesting presentation, giving the participants not only the overview about the growth of the gymnast and the years of perfect learning of the difficult skills, but also the background of this area, of this period, what is important for the health of the gymnasts and the future of the gymnasts. Thank you for that. Anyway,
longer. I was sure I was going to be able to do this in 40 minutes, but as always,
I can imagine. Yeah. And just now I see one question in question and answers. Please, everybody, if you have any question, use this this option, question and answers, and write down your question, and we will read it, and Hardy will answer. Please, can you confirm where we can find the skill matrix grids you are talking about, with which age each skill should be at which level of competitive readiness? Thanks.
Yeah, good question. They actually exist in two slightly different formats, but the content is the same. They exist in the Academy technical manuals, and if on the age group program, which is online, if you look the manuals, the manual is there in French, English, and Spanish. It'll be at the back of that manual.
You mean the participants need to go to FIG website?
Yeah, you go on the FIG website under education.
Yes.
And then under education, there'll be age group, and then you'll find the manual. Now, each of those manuals, they have the sample routines, they have technical testing distributed among 10 difficulty levels for each category of skill and each sport. And then they have those skill acquisition profiles. Each of those was supposed to be linked to a video, and that apparently is not yet done, even though I submitted that a year ago. But the manuals are online, can be found.
Yes. So do we have some other question? Do you have some questions, you participants? Please use the question and answer section. From Christoph. Welcome, Christoph. I'm happy to see you again. You mentioned that learning complex skills is perhaps better during adolescence. Do you find this to be a more vulnerable time for losing moves with center of mass changes?
That's a really interesting question. And we've tried a number of times to actually have workshops, and with bringing in other specialists such as Dr. Thomas Heinen and so on to speak about the lost skill syndrome. And we did it for the men's community at the World Championship. We did it for the trampoline community. And I would think that the answer, Christoph, is probably yes, but I don't know exactly. Certainly learning skills and then increasing difficulty too quickly can increase the possibility of losing a skill. So let's say, and I have a dear friend of mine that I trained with, I was the first person in Canada to do a full twisting flyaway from high bar. And one of my friends, well, he learned it right away. And then within a half hour, he did a double twist and a triple twist. He could never do the full twist again because it didn't get solidified in this neuromuscular system. So yeah, I think, yeah, during that time period, gymnast tends to be more clumsy, biomechanical things change. If the skill is not really solidified and then you push to the next level, yeah, you can probably lose it. But I wish I could give a 100% answer. No one can. We had really some interesting comments. Peter Vidmar, who many of you would know is a former Olympic champion from the United States, he was there and talking about how he lost his dismount from high bar and how he punished himself by not eating. He forced himself to, he wouldn't eat until he could do that dismount again. So yeah, different strategies have been used.
Okay, thank you, Hardy. Do you have some other questions, dear participants? Yes, just now is coming. It is likely the landing area in DMT competition will become softer surface to protect injury.
Yeah, the stick landing problem, let's not call it a problem, but the stick landing situation really does increase peak forces. So a softer landing surface can help because it reduces or it increases the time over which forces are applied. Proper landing technique, as I mentioned, increases the time over which forces are applied. You have to be very careful though with the softer landing mats. They tend to deteriorate very rapidly. That they might be good for the first 100 landings, and after 100, 150 landings, you basically have to use a new mat. So if you do this in a competition, for 3 or 4 days of training and then competing, hundreds of gymnasts, that landing mat is basically useless. So yeah, soft landing mats can help. One of the other problems with soft surfaces is eversion of the ankle. So turning inward like this. So unless, again, there's training, this eversion can also cause problems, because when the ankle everts, it twists the tibia a little bit, and that puts pressure on the knee joint. So again, new landing surface requires new physical preparation. Everything takes time to have your body be accommodated to.
Okay, thank you, Hardy.
You know, one other question related to the stop landing. So one is landing on double mini, or tumbling, or high bar, the stick landing. The other one is to kill the bounce at the end of a trampoline routine. And I've been trying to find some information on the internal forces for that. I think they are enormous. And, you know, I think, and I can't prove it, but my guess is, you know, the gymnast has finished the routine and bounced out in control. Don't worry about how they end up stopping or how quickly they stop. Anyway, I think the forces are enormous there.
Okay. Do we have some other question? Yes. Would you have a recommendation on how early is suitable and safe to practice close to maximum strength training?
To practice, I'm not sure I understood that. To practice what?
To practice close to maximum strength training.
Oh, there's in strength training, in adapting the muscle to what you need in the future, there's a progression. There's all that safety training I talked about. So the muscles, the tissues, the tendons, the ligaments have to go through proprioceptive training and muscle balance and so on, those things I mentioned earlier. And then there has to be a period where the muscle is active. So muscular endurance, relatively low repetitions. And then there's a period where the muscle has to grow a bit, so hypertrophy training. So those are repetitions that you can do maximum 10 times. Okay, approximately 8 to 10 to 12. If you do them 30 times, you're back to muscular endurance. If you do them maximum only once or 2 times, now you're maximum strength. Then comes a time for maximum strength training, and it can be done independently. If it's for power, it can be done independently of strength training and speed training, the 2 parts of power. So I can, for example, this way, I'm actually doing neuromuscular training for speed. Okay, for this, say, pushing for back handsprings and so on. Not yet with very low resistance. Then I can get very strong. Then I can put the 2 together. And then I have speed with strength, I have power. At what age? I don't think we should worry about maximum power until after puberty. Maximum expression of strength. In fact, when you look at the statistics on males, somewhat different for girls, the maximum strength, just pure maximum strength for a man is in the late 20s. Now we have these extremely strong gymnasts earlier than that, and strength training can be done, neuromuscular training can be done at a younger age, but we need rest periods in between.
Okay, thank you. And maybe the last question, do we have some?
No more questions?
No more questions? Okay.
Point out another interest. Like I say, I did quite a bit of reading trying to see what is out there that might be of interest. One was on double bouncing. Sometimes a coach with a gymnast bouncing on trampoline. Of course, the experienced coach knows how to do that in a synchronized way. If those things are unsynchronized, or they can be really dangerous for the smaller gymnast. There's one piece of data that goes an 80 kilogram coach with a 25 kilogram gymnast, and asymmetric bouncing causes energy transfer to the gymnast that can be about 14 times the normal forces, similar to landing on a hard surface from 2.8 meters. It's interesting. So if you're going to do synchronized bouncing, learn how to do it correctly, or better, not at all.
Okay, thank you, Hardy.
Thank you so much, everyone. Stay safe out there.
And just a moment, please. I will share my screen. I need to find the correct window. Okay.
Okay, so everyone, thank you so much and stay safe. I hope this has been of some value. Again, the focus always has to be on what can we do to serve our gymnasts better and therefore serve our sport. Stay safe.
Hardy, thank you again. I'm really happy to have you here today, and I'm really happy to talk to you again. And I hope we will continue also in the future. For the participants, the next webinar we will have 27th of February. It will be dedicated to double mini trampoline, and the expert will be my colleague from the European Gymnastics TC, Luis Nunes from Portugal. Everybody from you knows him, I think, very well, and he is the right expert, as he was a double mini top gymnast, coached the world champion, and is giving a lot of courses and a lot of lectures in double mini as well. We are also discussing the next round of the webinars, what is just now in the preparation, and if decided to have next round, we will inform all national federations. So, thank you very much for your attention, for being with us tonight, and I hope everything is going well with you, and please stay safe and healthy, and see you next time. Thank you and bye-bye.